Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
Thanksgiving dinners in my family have always felt less like a holiday and more like a stage play where every role was already cast before I was even born. My brother Michael was the golden boy, the center of every conversation, the one whose successes, however small, were inflated into something that sounded almost heroic. I, on the other hand, was the background character, the one who was tolerated, the one who was occasionally asked to refill a glass or pass the rolls, but never really invited into the spotlight. By the time I hit my 30s, I had stopped waiting for the script to change, because it never did. The build-up to this particular Thanksgiving was no different. I walked in already knowing exactly how it would go. Michael would sit at the head of the table next to Dad, his wife and kids would be praised for every little detail of their lives, and Mom would beam at him as if he hung the moon. Meanwhile, I'd be asked some perfunctory questions about work, and as soon as I answered, the conversation would pivot back to Michael. It was so predictable that I almost laughed at myself for still hoping it might feel different. But what made this year unique was what I was carrying with me, quietly folded inside an envelope that I had slipped into my bag. I had thought about this moment for months, not with the intention of causing chaos, but with the certainty that if I didn't take back some control over my own life, I'd suffocate under the weight of always being less. Dinner started the usual way. Dad asked Michael about his job, and Michael launched into a story about how he had saved a project that everyone else had apparently botched. His wife chimed in with updates about their kids' extracurricular activities, and Mom nodded along proudly, glancing at me only when she remembered I existed. I answered a few bland questions about work, keeping my responses short because I knew no one cared to listen. And then, as if the script demanded a climax, Mom leaned back in her chair, smirked in my direction, and delivered the line that I will never forget. "The family home should go to Michael," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of smugness only a mother who believes she is stating the obvious can muster. "He has a real family to provide for." The words hit me like a slap, though not because they were new. Versions of that message had been delivered to me my entire life. What hurt was how easily she said it, in front of everyone, without a shred of hesitation or guilt. To her, it was simply the natural order of things. Michael deserved, I did not. Michael was the future, I was expendable. I looked around the table. Michael's grin was almost smug, like he'd been waiting for her to say it out loud. His wife gave me a quick glance that I couldn't read, but she didn't speak up. Dad just gave a small nod, as though the decision had been obvious for years. I felt the sting in my chest, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I smiled. Not the fake, polite smile I had trained myself to wear through countless family events, but a calm, deliberate smile that held back a storm. I reached down into my bag, pulled out the envelope, and placed it gently on the table. The sound of it sliding across the wood cut through the chatter like a knife. I didn't say a word, and I didn't need to. Every pair of eyes moved toward it, confusion flickering across their faces. Mom frowned. "What's this supposed to be?" she asked, her voice carrying the same dismissive edge she always used with me. I leaned back slightly, still smiling, and simply said, "Why don't you open it?" There was a pause. Michael looked suspicious. Dad looked irritated, like I was interrupting his dinner. Mom reached for it, still smirking, as if she expected it to be some childish attempt at making a point, maybe a letter about fairness or a dramatic plea for attention. She slid her finger under the flap, pulled out the paper, and her expression froze. For the first time in my life, I watched my mother lose control of her face. Her smirk vanished, her eyes darted across the words, and then her hand trembled just slightly. Her fork slipped from her other hand and clattered onto the floor, the sound echoing in the silence that followed. No one spoke. Michael leaned forward, his face red, demanding to know what she was looking at. Dad tried to peer over her shoulder, but she kept the paper clutched tightly, her knuckles whitening. Her lips parted, but no words came out. And I sat there, calm, smiling, feeling something I had never felt at that table before: power. The air in the room had shifted. They didn't know it yet, but the entire script of our family had just been rewritten. And I was the one holding the pen. When Mom's fork clattered onto the floor, The room seemed to stop breathing for a moment, and in that silence I could almost hear years of swallowed frustration bubbling up in my chest, but I didn't let any of it show on my face. I just sat there, steady, watching her eyes dart across the page as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying, something that fit into the story she had written for herself about who held control in this family. Dad leaned closer, irritated, asking what on earth was going on, while Michael impatiently reached for the paper, demanding to see it, certain it was nothing more than some trick. But as the seconds dragged on, Mom's face gave everything away, her smirk gone, replaced by confusion that was quickly edging into fear. Finally, Michael snatched it from her hands, his voice rising as he tried to sound commanding, but underneath the bravado there was a note of panic. He scanned the document and his jaw tightened, then he looked at me like I had pulled the rug out from under his entire life. "This isn't real," he barked, his voice sharp and desperate. "You're bluffing." But he knew. He could see the signatures, he could see the stamps, and most importantly, he could see the date. I leaned forward, finally deciding to speak, my tone measured, almost casual, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "It's very real," I said, looking directly at him and then at my parents. "The deed was updated 2 years ago, when the house was about to be taken from under you after Michael's last financial disaster. Remember that, Mom? Remember when you called me in tears because the bank was closing in and you said you didn't know what else to do?" The room was dead silent except for the clink of Michael's wife setting her fork down, her eyes wide as she glanced between us. Dad shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, because he remembered. They all remembered, but they had buried it under their own convenient story that Michael was the strong one, the provider, the one who mattered. In reality, when it came down to saving the only real asset they had, Michael hadn't been able to lift a finger. It had been me. I let the words sink in, then continued. "You asked me to help because you didn't have anyone else to turn to. Michael said he couldn't, because he had a real family to take care of, and you repeated it to me like it was gospel, like my existence didn't count. But I stepped in anyway, because even after everything, I couldn't just let the house go. I paid off the mortgage, I cleared the debts, and I sat with the lawyer who drew up the documents. You all signed them without reading the fine print, because you assumed I was just doing you a favor. But I wasn't doing you a favor. I was taking control." Michael's wife whispered something under her breath, but Michael cut her off, his voice louder, angrier, insisting that I had tricked them, that I had stolen what was his by right. I raised my eyebrow, keeping my tone even. "Stolen?" I asked, letting the word hang in the air. "I didn't steal anything. I paid for it. I worked for it. I sacrificed for it. While you were living like the golden child, cushioned by excuses and covered up mistakes, I was the one who had to scrape and grind to keep myself afloat. And when the house was on the line, you were nowhere to be found. Tell me, Michael, how does that add up to me stealing anything?" Mom tried to speak, her voice cracking, muttering something about how we were supposed to be a family, how this was supposed to stay between us, but the words sounded hollow now. The authority she used to wield over me was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. Dad finally spoke up, demanding to know why I hadn't told them sooner, why I had waited until now to reveal this. I met his eyes and said quietly, "Because I wanted you to understand exactly how it feels to be blindsided by your own family. I wanted you to sit in that same shock I sat in for years. Every time you dismissed me, every time you made it clear I was less than Michael. This is what it feels like." The weight of the room shifted. For the first time in my life, they weren't looking at me like the expendable daughter, the one they could shove aside whenever it suited them. They were looking at me as someone who had pulled off something they never saw coming, someone who had outmaneuvered them in a game they thought I wasn't even smart enough to play. Michael shoved the papers back onto the table, his face red, his voice trembling with rage as he pointed at me and spat. "You set this up, didn't you? You've been planning this the whole time." I didn't deny it. I looked him squarely in the eye and said calmly, "Yes, I did." And in that moment, the entire table realized that the narrative they had clung to for decades, the one where Michael was the shining star and I was just the shadow, had just been shattered. The pieces were still falling around them, and I was only getting started. Michael's accusation hung in the air like a dare, and while everyone waited for me to flinch or retreat the way I always had, I reached into my bag again and set a thick folder on the table, not with drama or spite, but with the kind of steady certainty that comes from knowing you are no longer asking anyone for permission to exist. And when I opened it and began laying out neatly clipped stacks of statements, transfer confirmations, tax receipts, and notarized letters from the bank officer who handled the refinance, the room finally shifted from outrage to silence, because paper speaks in a language that even denial understands, and every page carried my name where there should have been if their version of the story were true. I told them I had kept records not out of paranoia or a need to hold something over their heads, but because I learned early that in this family facts got rewritten when they were inconvenient, so I printed everything that mattered. The past due notices that arrived in a pale envelope the winter the mortgage fell behind, the 3 missed payments that triggered the foreclosure warning, the property tax bill that had been kicked down the road until the penalties ballooned, the contractor invoice for the emergency heater repair after the system failed during a cold snap and Dad decided to gamble on a cheaper part that never arrived, and the line in my bank history where the money left my account and landed exactly where it needed to go to make the house stop bleeding. I slid one receipt toward Dad and watched his eyes catch on the routing number, then drift to the date, and I reminded him of the night he called me from the driveway because he did not want Mom to hear the worry in his voice. How he said he would pay me back as soon as Michael sorted out his bonus, how I told him not to wait because the penalties were stacking by the day and the house did not care about excuses, and how I drove over and handed him a cashier's check because I knew if I gave cash it would vanish into a different problem and the bank would still be waiting. Michael muttered that I was making it sound worse than it was, that every family goes through tight months, that I was acting like a savior when I was just being dramatic, and I did not raise my voice or tell him what I was really thinking. I simply placed in front of him a printout of the email thread where he said he could not contribute because his credit cards were maxed and the new car lease had penalties he did not want to trigger, and I let his wife read the line where he wrote that my help was convenient because she does not have dependents so she can afford it, a sentence so clean and cruel that even Mom could not pretend it meant something else. I explained that the deed change did not appear out of nowhere, that it was tied to the refinance package the bank insisted on after their risk team flagged the account, that the attorney, who had no interest in our household politics, walked all of us through the signatures and the rights and the obligations, and while they nodded and signed like people sign privacy policies they never intend to read, I listened, asked questions, and paid attention because the house is not a trophy. The house is a set of responsibilities that do not care about birth order or pride, and I was done carrying those responsibilities invisibly while being told I did not count. Mom tried to pivot to moral ground, saying family does not tally debts or keep score, and I told her families do not keep score until they are told they are less, and then the math becomes survival. And while I could have rubbed their faces in every unpaid bill and every polite lie, I kept it simple and said that from this night forward anything tied to the house would be handled through me so that nothing would slip. And I watched the realization land that the late-night phone calls and panicked favors had just lost their power because I would no longer be a silent donor they could forget when it was convenient. Michael said I had embarrassed him, that I was airing private business and trying to ruin his reputation, and I answered that reputations do not break when truth comes out. Reputations break when the story people tell about themselves cannot survive a single document. Then I asked him if he wanted me to stop here or if he wanted me to lay out the other folder I kept. The one labeled with a month and a word that none of us had spoken aloud at this table, even though we all knew it like a bruise. You stopped touching, and when his eyes flicked to Dad and then back to me, I knew he remembered exactly which word I meant. I rested my hand on that second folder without opening it, and I said that I had stayed quiet that first time because Dad begged and Mom cried, and I was told it would never happen again. And I believed them because I wanted to believe that if I carried the shame then maybe the family would carry me, but I had learned my lesson. And if Michael wanted to keep pretending that the past was a rumor, then I would let the past speak for itself right now with names and dates and signed agreements, and the only question was whether he was ready for everyone at this table to hear it. He swallowed hard and told me to sit down, to stop, to at least spare the kids from hearing details they were not old enough to understand, and I said I agreed completely. Which is why I had already arranged for my cousin to take them into the den for dessert and a movie before I ever walked in with this envelope, and I watched understanding spread as they realized this was not an outburst. This was a plan. Then I folded my hands, met every eye without blinking, and asked one simple thing in a voice that carried to the end of the table without rising even a notch. Should I explain the situation, or would Michael like to do it himself? Michael stared at the unopened folder like it might detonate if he touched it, and while everyone else waited for the next explosion, I decided to give him a clean way out because I am not heartless, and I know what it feels like to be cornered. So I told him he could speak first if he wanted to tell his version, and when he shook his head and muttered that there was nothing to say, I opened the folder myself and laid the first document on the table, which was the payment plan from the credit counseling service that listed every card he had defaulted on and the minimums he had skipped for months, and I watched his wife trace the totals with her fingertip while her face rearranged itself into something tight and tired. The kind of expression a person wears when they realize the story they were sold was missing several crucial chapters. I said that the debts were not even the part that broke me, because money can be fixed if people tell the truth. And then I slid out the agreement from the lawyer who handled the settlement for the fender bender that was not simply a bump in a parking lot, but a late-night near-miss that ended with a frightened young driver calling her father from the curb. And I reminded them that the reason the settlement stayed quiet was because I wrote the check to make it go away after Mom called me sobbing. That the police report would ruin Michael's job prospects, and I told them I would never have put my name on that money if I had known I would be repaid with the line that I do not count, because I do not have a so-called real family. Mom started in with the familiar plea about keeping private matters private, and I answered that privacy in this house had always meant silence for me and a clean slate for Michael. And I was done handing out clean slates like party favors while I sat in the corner pretending the stains did not exist, and then I placed the emails on the table. The ones where Dad wrote that it would be better if I took the lead because the bank listened to me and the adjuster liked me, and the ones where Michael promised to set up a repayment plan as soon as he got his next promotion, which never came because the numbers on his performance review did not miraculously change just because he thought they should. And I let the words sit there in the open where everyone could see them rather than tucked inside my phone like a secret I was expected to guard forever. Michael said I was twisting things to make him look bad, and I told him I did not need to twist anything because the facts were twisted enough on their own. Then I turned to his wife and said gently that I was sorry she was finding out like this. But I had been asked to carry this alone for years, and I would not carry it anymore, and I watched her inhale slowly and square her shoulders like someone who has already decided that denial is not a strategy she is willing to live with, which was more grace than anyone at this table had ever offered me. I reminded them that the house nearly slipped through their hands because of a chain of choices that started with pretending Michael would magically fix things and ended with me writing checks and signing documents while being told to stand quietly at the back of the photo. And I said that if they wanted to call what I did manipulative, they could go right ahead, but manipulation was what they had done every time they wrapped a demand in the language of family and then turned around and praised Michael for being responsible even when he was not, and I was simply done playing along with a script that erased me in order to protect his image. Dad asked in a small voice if I was going to ruin Thanksgiving for the rest of our lives by dragging this out, and I told him I was actually saving our future by dragging the rod into daylight so it could not keep growing under the floorboards. And then I picked up one last sheet, a notarized note that Michael signed the night we moved money to stop a lien, which stated that if he failed to repay me by the end of that year, I would be free to resolve the matter however I saw fit, including disclosing the underlying facts to any family member affected by the risk, and I said it in front of him while I said that I had honored my silence long past the deadline because I wanted to believe he would choose better, but he had not. And now I was choosing better for myself. The room was so quiet that I could hear the clock in the hallway, and I let that quiet stretch until it felt like everyone was finally hearing themselves think rather than defaulting to the usual roles. Then I said that tonight was not about humiliating anyone. It was about correcting a story that had kept me small, and if they were waiting for me to apologize, they would be waiting a very long time, because the person who had been trained to apologize for existing did not live here anymore, and the woman sitting at this table had earned every ounce of authority she was claiming. Michael's wife spoke at last and asked the only sensible question in the room, which was what happens now, and I told her that what happens now is boundaries, accountability, and a new distribution of power that reflects who actually showed up when it mattered. And I added that I had one more piece to place on the board, something that would make the next part very simple for everyone to understand. Then I looked at Mom and Dad and said that it concerned the will, and I asked them if they wanted to tell the room what they signed 2 years ago, or if they preferred that I do it for them. When I asked them if they wanted to explain what they signed 2 years ago or if they preferred that I do it, the silence that followed was not dignified or wise. It was the kind of silence people use when they are hoping a moment will pass without them having to own it. So I took a breath and said I would keep it simple because none of this needed dramatics, it only needed truth, and the truth was that the day we saved the house we also moved it into a living trust at the attorney's insistence. Not because I wanted to play queen of the castle, but because the bank wanted proof that the person paying the bill had the authority to keep paying it, which meant documents were drafted, signatures were witnessed, and the trustee named on every page was me. I said that the will update they signed that same week did not erase them or cut them out of their own lives. It poured everything they owned into that trust with me in charge of decisions so that we would never again flirt with foreclosure or watch penalties multiply while people argued about who should handle what. And if anyone at this table had actually read the summary the attorney mailed the next morning, they would have seen exactly what I saw, which is that I was responsible for taxes and maintenance and long-term protection. They were guaranteed the right to live here for the rest of their lives, and Michael had no claim on the house now or later unless I released one to him, which I had no intention of doing because I had watched him turn obligations into wishes too many times to hand him a set of keys to the only thing still standing. Dad asked if that meant I could throw them out, and I told him no, that is not what it means. It means they keep a life estate inside the trust so long as basic conditions are met. Conditions that are not cruel or controlling. Conditions we agreed to in that office when the attorney said we should avoid gray areas, so tonight I was simply putting them in writing, starting with the rule that no one uses this house as collateral for anyone's private mess ever again. No secret loans. No quiet liens, no friendly signatures on paperwork that becomes my emergency, and if a repair is needed or a contractor is hired it goes through me because I am the one who pays the invoice, and I am not doing mystery favors in the dark anymore. Mom tried to reach for the old script about family unity, and I told her she could have unity or she could have backroom deals, but she could not have both. Then I turned to Michael and said that the spare key he has had since college would be returned tonight. The garage code would be changed tomorrow, and his name, which somehow made its way onto the home insurance as an additional driver years ago when he borrowed the car for a month, would be removed before the weekend, and if he chose to take that personally, he should remember that boundaries feel like punishment to people who profited from the lack of them. Michael's wife asked very quietly if I expected them to disappear, and I told her the opposite was true. I expected them to show up honestly, which would be new for all of us, and to make that easier I was offering a path that did not require humiliation. Starting with a written repayment plan for a portion of what I covered, not because I need the money to function, but because people treat what they pay for differently than what they are handed, and if Michael was not ready for that conversation tonight, he could email me next week, and we would set it up with dates and amounts that a grown adult can meet without drama. I slid one last paper across the table, a short letter addressed to my parents that summarized everything in plain language and named me as the person authorized to make decisions if either of them became unable to handle the house. And I said that copies of the trust, the deeds, the will, and tonight's summary were in my safe deposit box and with the attorney, so there would be no more arguments later about what was said, and if anyone tried to rewrite the past again, the documents would do the talking, and I would not waste breath begging to be believed. Then I did the one thing none of them expected. I told my parents they could stay as long as they wanted under a $1 life lease that we would sign next week, so there would be no fear of surprises. And I told Michael that I would not cut him out of birthdays or holidays because I am not interested in building a victory out of a pile of ashes. But I also told him I would never again absorb the cost of his pride or the fallout of his messes. And if he ever repeated the line that I do not count, because I do not have a so-called real family, I would forward the entire paper trail to every relative who ever parroted that nonsense and let the truth do what I have been doing alone for years. I picked up the empty envelope that had started all of this and slipped it into my bag, and when Mom finally asked in a small voice if this was my way of punishing them, I said no, this is my way of ending a story that never made room for me. And if it felt like punishment, that was only because the story had been good to the people who wrote it and cruel to the person who was told to keep quiet. And then I stood, thanked everyone for dinner, and told them I would see them next week with a notary and a set of keys ready to trade, because tonight the deed on the table was not a weapon, it was a line in the ground, and for the first time in my life I was the one who got to draw it.